Picture this. You and a few of your closest friends are on a plane, headed towards what you anticipate being an unforgettable weekend getaway. All of a sudden, you encounter some rough turbulence, but it's nothing unfamiliar. However, the situation quickly escalates as the plane plunges through the air, causing baggage to cascade down from the overhead compartments. And as you cling onto your armrest, your knuckles pale with the force of your grip. Suddenly, you find yourself overcome by an icy chill, still secured to your seat, which has detached from the rest of the plane. You hurtle towards the ground, but against all odds, you manage to survive the impact. You may not be aware of it yet, but you've arrived in an exceedingly harsh environment, considered to be one of the most unforgiving for human survival. You are surrounded by mountains and devoid of any signs of life, including vegetation and animals. Despite being alive, you will soon start to feel the pangs of hunger. Before long, your friend may inform you of their intention to resort to cannibalism by saying, "I'm going to eat the pilot." It may seem too incredible to be true, but this is precisely what unfolded. The story of the survivor that outshines all others, one that is both an account of courage and grief, a harrowing tale that is difficult to fathom being a part of. Let us commence with the start of the story. The day is Thursday, October 12th, 1972, and a group of friends who are part of the same rugby team from Montevideo, Uruguay, are en route to a match in Chile. A total of 45 individuals are present on the aircraft, comprising not only the youthful, physically fit players, but also certain members of the team's family, supporters, and 5 crew members. Unbeknownst to the group, the American-manufactured Fairchild FH-227D aircraft they have boarded is commonly referred as a lead sled due to its considerable weight and relatively underpowered engines. In the near future, they will also discover the reason behind its abysmal safety history. At present, their sole knowledge regarding the aircraft is that it provides the most cost-effective means of traversing the Andes mountain range and reaching Santiago for what they expect to be an enjoyable rugby match. The first part of the trip is cut short due to a storm brewing over the Andes, and they are forced to stop over in Mendoza, Argentina. Although a direct route to Santiago is available from Mendoza, the aircraft is incapable of reaching the necessary altitude of 25,000 to 26,000 feet to traverse the mountains. As an alternative, it will follow a route resembling a U-turn that avoids the highest summits by circumnavigating them. On Friday the 13th, they resume their journey. During the flight, one of the players, Nando Parrado, selflessly offers his window seat to his friend to enable him to better appreciate the scenic mountains. Little did Nando know that this minor act of kindness would ultimately prove to be life-saving. Shortly thereafter, turbulence commences, initially dismissed as a minor issue. However, the passenger soon observes that the mountains appear remarkably close to the aircraft, almost as if they are adjacent. Unbeknown to the passengers, the pilot and co-pilot have committed a huge error. They informed the air traffic controllers they were only 1 minute away from the airport. However, the thick clouds obstructed their view and they misjudged the time, as they were actually 11 minutes away. At this point, the aircraft had not yet reached a secure location where they could execute a right turn towards the airport, and they were still navigating through the mountains. Despite the unfavorable conditions, the pilots proceeded to descend, resulting in the aircraft encountering additional turbulence since they were in the midst of the mountains where the winds were erratic. The plane was jostled about and the clouds abruptly cleared, revealing a dark ridge looming directly in front of them. The pilots endeavored to maneuver upwards and hasten their speed, and the passengers became aware that they were in a perilous situation. As the plane collided with a ridge, the rear portion was ripped off, and the aircraft was propelled forward. Even though the plane was approximately 13,800 feet above sea level, it probably struck another mountain, causing the wings to detach, leaving only the front segment of the fuselage. Individuals situated at the back of the plane were hurled into the mountainous terrain, with some remaining alive in the aircraft. Nonetheless, there was no time for contemplation. In an instant, the remaining portion of the plane collided with a snow-covered peak. It is truly astounding that any portion of the plane managed to withstand such a devastating impact. However, what follows is even more remarkable. The plane commences sliding down the mountain like a sled, yet remarkably avoids colliding with any jagged rocks or boulders. It continues sliding lower and lower until it finally halts at an altitude of 11,710 feet above sea level. The survivors find themselves in a chaotic scene. Seats are dislodged and bodies are thrown against the front of the cockpit. Despite the violence of the crash, many passengers have miraculously survived. Some are writhing in pain with twisted limbs and fragments of the aircraft embedded in their bodies. However, their surroundings are equally daunting. They are stranded in a desolate glacier field, so isolated that the location has no name. Rescue is unlikely, and the thin air at this altitude makes it hard to breathe, while the cold is unbearable. The less injured survivors take on the responsibility of helping those who are worse off. Some have broken bones, while others are on the brink of death from internal injuries. Nando is in a coma and will remain unconscious for 3 days. Out of the 45 passengers on the plane, 12 died instantly from the impact or when they were ejected from the plane. Some of the deceased are still secured to their seats, buried in snow, not far from the crash area. The initial night is severely cold, with the temperature plummeting to as low as -22 degrees Fahrenheit or -30 degrees Celsius. The survivors gather inside the fuselage, attempting to seal the openings with debris and luggage which is strewn all around the cabin, all while under the impression that a rescue team will locate them, and this will be their only night on the mountain. Unfortunately, they are mistaken. Unbeknownst to them, the white hue of the plane renders it invisible from an aerial perspective. During the first night, an additional 5 people succumb to their wounds. Unaware of the tragic news, Nando remains in a coma, while his mother has passed away and his sister is on the verge of death. Nando had invited them on the flight with the promise of using the unoccupied seats without charge, a decision that would ultimately become his most significant regret in life. The following day, medical attention is provided to the wounded, with some individuals still shrieking from multiple fractures in their limbs. The pilot has passed away, while the co-pilot responsible for the grave error is discovered trapped beneath rubble, but miraculously alive. The co-pilot reveals to the other survivors that he possesses a handgun, requesting that they use it to end his suffering. Though they refuse to take his life, he passes away shortly thereafter. The group is now faced with a pressing issue of obtaining food. At elevated altitudes in such frigid conditions, the body burns calories rapidly in an effort to maintain warmth. After thoroughly combing through all of the baggage, it becomes apparent that although an ample supply of cigarettes and alcohol is available, provisions are limited. The meager rations consist of 8 chocolate bars, a can of mussels, 3 jars of jam, a can of almonds, and a small quantity of candy, and several bottles of wine. Without delay, the survivors establish a rationing plan, realizing that the available resources are scarcely sufficient for the considerable number of people, and they remain uncertain about how long they will need to subsist on them. Fortunately, they possess a source of water, which they can melt and collect in vacant wine bottles. As time progresses, more individuals perish. 10 days later, Nando regains consciousness, and he cradles his sister as she takes her final breaths. He would subsequently recount that he had drifted off to slumber and awoke to a living nightmare. Despite their dire circumstances, matters were bound to deteriorate further, as they found a transistor radio amongst the debris, relaying the disheartening news the search party had ceased their efforts to locate them. The realization that they were stranded, frigid, and starving struck them with overwhelming despair. In this moment of extreme desperation, Nando confided in a friend, "I am going to eat the pilot." In truth, a handful of the survivors had been considering the same notion. One individual subsequently disclosed to the press, "Our common goal was to survive, yet what we lacked was food. The meager provisions we had from the wreckage had long been depleted, and there was no flora or fauna in sight." Within a matter of days, they experienced the unsettling sensation of their own bodies devouring themselves merely to stay alive. They did not view their actions as cannibalistic, but rather as an imperative measure to endure and reunite with their loved ones. They found themselves with an unenviable ultimatum: consume their companions or succumb to death. With 27 individuals still alive, providing food for the sizable group became a daunting challenge. They began by stripping the pilots' corpses of all the feasible meat, even going so far as to eating their organs, driven by their ravenous minds, urging them to eat more, eat everything, don't waste a bit. However, on the 17th day, tragedy struck once more. In the dead of night, they were startled awake by a noise akin to the thunderous gallop of stampeding horses, as one survivor later recalled. An avalanche descended upon them, causing snow to burst through the breach in the plane and fill the entire fuselage. Those who were still alive scrambled to dig out air pockets and locate their companions. An additional 8 people perished, while the remaining were buried in the darkness under layers of snow with minimal air to breathe for 3 days. Eventually, the snow thawed and the fuselage emerged, resting atop the snow once more. As days passed, they endured by eating more of the newly deceased. They smoked cigarettes and embarked on brief exploratory expeditions. However, after traversing just a few hundred meters, exhaustion would set in. The snow was too deep, and the thin air, compounded with their weakened state, made it unbearable. They were also afflicted by snow blindness, a condition that occurs when sunlight reflects off the snow and burns the eyes. To combat their predicament, they fashioned makeshift snowshoes and sunglasses, enabling them to wander further. Nevertheless, they were hemmed in by treacherous crevices on all sides. One of the survivors later expressed, "We felt like insects, trapped in the hugest forces of nature." Surviving in such a harsh environment was a daunting challenge. During one of their exploratory missions, they stumbled upon the other part of the fuselage. Inside, they discovered some useful items such as batteries for the plane radio, a small amount of chocolate and candy, and even some comic books. The survivors spent the entire night reading the comics and warming themselves by the fire they had managed to build. They held onto hope for a while, thinking they could use the batteries to power a radio and call for help. However, it didn't take long for them to realize that none of them had the expertise to set up a functioning radio. As Nando recalled, "We were very depressed. He believed their only option was to try and trek out of the mountains." They knew that Chile was to the west and recalled the pilot's statement that they were close to their destination. However, they were unaware that the nearest road was nearly 37 miles away. Nevertheless, the hike would not be a simple task. The journey ahead was daunting. 37 miles of glaciers and treacherous terrain lay between them and Chile. None of them were seasoned outdoorsmen, but Nando understood that walking over the mountain range was their only choice. They made a plan to gather as much human meat as possible and only send the strongest men: Nando, Roberto Canessa, and Antonio Vicentin. By day 61, when they began their journey, only 16 survivors remained alive. Some were sick, and all of them were malnourished and weakened by the harsh weather. Before they set off, Carlitos Paez made them a sleeping bag using parts of the aircraft insulation sewn together with copper wire. Without the improvised sleeping bag made by Carlitos Paez, the 3 survivors would have likely perished during their trek. They spent 3 days ascending the first mountain, but instead of lush valleys, they saw more mountains in the distance. Vicentin decided to turn back and share his rations with the others. However, Nando and Canessa were determined to keep going and uttered, "We may die, but at least we'll die trying." Their determination paid off. Despite their exhaustion, they walked for several days until they stumbled upon the river, with patches of green visible through the melting snow. To their relief, they happened to see a man on the other side of the river. However, they were unable to cross over to meet him and had to spend the night there. The next morning, the man returned. The man had brought pen and paper with him, which he tied to a rock and threw across the river to the survivors. On the paper, Nando wrote a message that said they were survivors of a plane crash, had no food, couldn't walk anymore, and that more survivors were still in the mountains. He then threw the paper back to the man. The man left to get help, but he himself was hours away from civilization on horseback. By the 10th day, Nando and Canessa were rescued by the army, their emaciated bodies transported on horseback. For Nando, this moment marked a turning point, and he felt prepared to embrace life again. Later, helicopters arrived to locate the remaining survivors, and the pilots expressed disbelief that anyone could traverse such challenging terrain without proper equipment. Their incredible journey was retraced by experts years later, and even with modern equipment, the trek was found to be extremely perilous. On the 71st day, the first survivor was rescued, followed by the rest on the 72nd day. Despite suffering from various illnesses, all of the remaining survivors eventually recovered, and only one is no longer with us today. After the initial wave of celebration and admiration for the survivors, some people started questioning how they managed to survive for so long without any food, as it was deemed impossible. However, a photograph taken by the rescuers revealed the remains of a human body that had been stripped of its flesh. The survivors eventually confessed to having resorted to cannibalism in order to stay alive. This revelation led to public outrage, with many condemning them as savages. According to Nando, resorting to eating flesh was not an easy decision, but rather a last resort. He recounted how they attempted to eat strips of leather torn from pieces of luggage, but the chemicals used to treat the leather would have done them more harm than good. They tried to find straw in seat cushions, but only found inedible upholstery foam. Faced with the choice of either eating their deceased friends or dying themselves, the survivors had no other option. Unfortunately, one survivor who was reluctant to turn to cannibalism did not survive. Considering the extreme circumstances and life-threatening situation, would you have made the same decision as the 16 survivors who resorted to cannibalism to stay alive and make it off the mountain? Let us know in the comment section below.